all-star cast of characters full of conflict and plotting and scheming and physical altercations and plot twists and political intrigue. But before we get there, I want to show you this prophecy of Jesus I was telling you about. I want us to read Matthew chapter 10, verses 17 through 20. So you think in Matthew 6, 7, 8, the Sermon on the Mount. We get to chapter 10 and Jesus is sending out the 72. Here's what's going on. That's what's happening. Bunch of red letters here. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just read it up here with y'all. Matthew chapter 10. What did I say? Verses 17 through 20. These underlined words are important. Be on your guard against men, the crowds, the people, the mobs. Jesus is saying, be on your guard against the men because they will hand you over to the local councils and flog you in their synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Join me in a quick word of prayer. Father God, I ask that you bless our time this morning as you reveal to us through your word how you are maneuvering in ways that we could never even imagine or plan and see. And how, God, how your plans are so much bigger than ours, and how your abilities to handle the problems of life, and God, even our own problems are so much larger and so much more incredible. And God, you often handle our problems in ways we could never have dreamed or imagined. May we see that this morning as we see how you worked in and through Paul's life as well. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, y'all, look at this next slide right here. I got right here. There's some key words in this prophecy that I want to call to your attention, and I kind of want you to kind of remember those as we go along. I'd like for you to think about the men that he was talking about. Be aware of the men, because these crowds, they're going to hand you over to people, and you're going to be arrested, and you're going to be flogged, you're going to be beat. He says you're going to be handed over to local councils. So in Israel, that's the Jewish kind of ruling things. You're going to be handed over to governors. In Israel at this time, if it was a governor, that would not have been a Jewish thing. That would have been a Roman thing during this time. You're going to be handed over to kings. And why are you going to be handed over to all these people? As witnesses both to them and to the Gentiles. Now, I'm going to leave these words up there for a little while so you can kind of refer to them. And I want us to fast forward to our journey in Acts. Last week we looked at the end of Acts chapter 21 and 22, and Pastor Joe led us through the events that led to Paul being arrested, and then basically after being arrested having the opportunity to share his testimony to the crowd, to the men there in Jerusalem in Acts 21 chapter 37 and following. Now here's what you don't know. Joe and I talked about this week. Paul had this opportunity to share his testimony 4 more times in the next 5 chapters of Acts. As a matter of fact, if you were to look at my Bible, I showed Joe this. If you were to look at my Bible in Acts right here, many years ago, I started noticing this. So I took a little pen and I wrote testimony 1 right here in Acts chapter 21 and verse 37. If you turn the page here, you're going to see in Acts chapter 22 and verse 30, he's before the Sanhedrin, testimony 2. If you turn the page, you're going to see in Acts chapter 24, testimony 3. If you look at 25, you're going to see I wrote testimony 24. And if you look at Acts 25, verse 23, you're going to see testimony 5. So 5 different times Paul was called on to share his testimony, and I want to kind of reveal those to you going back to our words right here. So we get to Acts chapter 21, and let me get back there, Acts chapter 21 and verses 37 through 40. Now, when we get to 21, as Joe pointed out last week, in verse 27, it says Paul was arrested. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia, they saw Paul at the temple, and they stirred up all of the crowd, and they seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel," be on your guard against these men of Israel. "Men of Israel, help us, this man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law. Here he is." And it goes on down later. They were trying to kill him, and so the commander comes and kind of tries to stop the crowd from killing him, and they're about to take him away. And we get to verse 37. It says, as the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he says, "Do you speak in Greek?" He replied. And he said, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" And Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Sicily, a citizen of no ordinary citizen. Please let me speak to the crowd." Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps, and he motioned to the crowd. And when they were silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." Number one, Paul speaks to, let's go back to that slide. Paul speaks to the crowd and to the men in this first arrest. Now, if we look back at our text back there with Jesus speaking, it says the next group that he might speak to are the local council. So I turned in my Bible. Let's go back. You can go to the next slide. Acts chapter 22 and 23. So we're following along here, y'all. So I just want y'all to kind of follow along with me here and kind of see what happens. So Paul's kind of giving his defense there, and we see all that going on, and kind of he's in trouble, and the commanders are trying to take care of him, and the Roman commanders, they don't really understand the Jewish law. They don't really care about the Jewish law. But now they got this man who is a Roman citizen, and so the commanders kind of get together and say, what are we going to do with this guy, and what's going on? What law did he break? And so he says, well, let's get the priest and the Sanhedrin together. So I want to go there. We're in chapter 22 and verse 30. The next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priest and the Sanhedrin to assemble. And then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. And then after a few verses, Paul then spoke, giving his defense. Well, what is the Sanhedrin? It's the local ruling council in Jerusalem. Okay, that's what it is, the local ruling council. All right, go back to the next slide. Paul has given his testimony. They've arrested him. As a matter of fact, they've punched him. We're going to see later in verse 23. So they're going to flog you, and they've arrested him. They've handed him over. He has spoke to the local ruling council. Guess who he's probably going to speak to next? I'm going to let everybody guess. Y'all be real loud. Help me out here. Who? Okay, let me turn to my Bible and see what happens next. So he gets transferred from Jerusalem to this really cool place on the beach called Caesarea. Mike Franklin and I have been there. Y'all, by the way, on the way, he spent the night at this place called Antipatris. Mike Franklin and I, when we were BSU summer missionaries in Israel, where we were stationed, we could walk down this river through the woods, and we came to the ruins of Antipatris. So it's kind of a cool place to me in my memory. I've kind of been there. But Paul now, he's left Jerusalem where kind of Rome is in charge, but the Jews still have the Sanhedrin and the chief priest and the Romans, as long as things don't get out of hand, the Romans let them have, their own kind of rule and law as long as they're not in trouble. But now they want to kill this dude, and they find out that there actually is a plot. If you read these chapters, they say, hey, they tell the Sanhedrin, go send for Paul again, and we've got 30 men who said they are not going to eat a bite or drink anything until we kill this dude. Paul's sister overhears this, and they go tell the story to the commanders, and the commander's like, oh no, we got to get this dude out of Jerusalem. So they get a big cavalry, and they send him off to Caesarea. So he gets to Caesarea, and so 5 days later, the high priest, I'm in chapter 24. 5 days later, the high priest, Ananias, went down to Caesarea. Now, when he got to Caesarea, they still wanted to have this trial of Paul. So they told the people in Jerusalem, you can come to Caesarea and make your case before him there. So Paul got to Caesarea, where the governor of the whole province is. The chief priest and some of the people travel to Caesarea and make their accusations against Paul. And then you could have guessed in chapter 24 and verse 10, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that a number of years, blah, blah, blah. Paul gives his third testimony to the governor. If you read, Felix is the governor for a while, and after a while he's no longer the governor, and another governor takes over, and his name is Festus. And Paul gives his testimony. So his fourth testimony, Paul gives his testimony before Festus again. And we get to chapter 25 and verse 12, and it says, after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. All right, so look at our next slide. So he's been before the men. He's been punched. He's been arrested. He's been handed over. He has given his defense to the local council. He has given his defense to the governors. Now I'm going to let y'all guess who Paul is probably going to give his defense to now. Everybody tell me. What does it say in chapter 25, verse 13? A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea. Guess who Paul gives his defense to now? The King Agrippa. Let's go back to that slide again. Don't worry. Watch out for these men who are going to hand you over to the local councils, to the governors, to the kings. When that happens, don't worry about what you're going to say, because you're not going to be speaking. I'm going to be speaking before you, because I have chosen you to be a witness both to the Jews and to the Gentiles. Let me go back to chapter 23 now, my chapter, and read verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, he's in prison. This is for the plot to kill him, and they send him away to Caesarea. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage, Paul. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify about me in Rome. Y'all, what I want you to see is God is maneuvering all the little pieces here. If any prophetic word was ever fulfilled word by word, certainly this is one of them. Jesus is saying to Paul, take courage. I got a plan for you. Let me show y'all something that I found even maybe more interesting and more amazing. Do y'all remember when Paul had the Damascus Road experience? We've been there. God sent this dude named Ananias to him to restore his sight. Y'all might remember, Paul's on the road. He's blinded. He's carried into the city. there, and God speaks to this guy named Ananias, and he says, I want you to go to this place and restore the vision of this man named Paul. He's my chosen servant. And Ananias said, God, I am so excited about going to do that for you. Is that what he said? No. Let me turn there. Let me make sure I got this right. Acts chapter 9, verses 13 through 16. Here it is. I'll read it here. Lord, Ananias answered, I've heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And he has come here with, that word should be authority, but that's my typing, okay? Authority from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. But the Lord said to Ananias, I want y'all to see this. Go! Exclamation point. He's it's kind of a little bit like, Ananias, this is none of your business. Ananias has a very, very, very small picture of what is going on here. What Ananias is seeing is who Paul has been and what he's done. And Ananias is not sure if God is really thinking correctly. He really kind of wants to help God out, and he even explains to God as if God don't know what Paul has been doing. God, don't you know that this guy has done? Go. And then look what he says. This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings, before the Gentiles and their kings, and before the people of Israel. Right here. Ananias, don't you worry about this guy, Paul, thinking he's got it easy or something, or worried about me choosing Paul. Don't you worry about Paul. I'll show him how much he must suffer for my sake. And from that point on, in so many ways, Paul did. You see, God has been working this plan out since the day of his salvation. God saw this suffering that Paul would endure decades before it ever happened. God not only saw it, he used it to accomplish its purposes. It's why he told Ananias, you don't worry about Paul. He will face his own giants. You just go. Now I want to read our text from chapters 23. And I also want you to think about this part where he says, when they call you before men, don't worry about what you'll say. Because I'll speak for you, because I think that really happened in this text in ways that are almost comical. Y'all, the ways that God does things is bigger than we could ever imagine. Whoever thought that God would tell people to walk around a city once a day, every day for 7 days, and then on the last day, get your biggest ramparts and ram into the walls? Is that what he said? No, what did he say do? Shout. And guess what happened? The walls fell. I'm assuming y'all know some of these stories with me, okay? All the ways that God works, y'all, what I'm trying to say, are so beyond, many times, our ability to see or comprehend. And Joe, here's the problem for us. We've talked about it over and over and over again. Sometimes we think it's about our smarts. Sometimes we think it's about our ability. Sometimes we think it's about our gifts, Ari, and everybody. You know, sometimes we think it's about what we got to do and what we got to fix and what we got to plan. And we got to always remember that God can do in an instant more than we can do in a lifetime of trying. We need to remember that. And I want you to think about it when we read this text, because y'all, Paul is enemy number one. Everybody hates him. But let's go back to chapter 23 and just look at how this story unfolds, because it's just almost comical. All right, I'm going to be reading Acts chapter 23, beginning in verse 1. No, I'm going to back up to 22, verse 30 to get the context. The next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, he released him and he ordered the chief priest and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Why? Because Paul said, "I have followed God in good conscience." That's why. If you follow that, Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "You dare to insult God's high priest?" And Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Here's where it gets good. And here's where I think God just kind of gives him the words to say. Y'all ever heard the phrase divide and conquer? Listen to this. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, this could read like this. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Republicans and some of them Democrats, said, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. There was a great uproar. At this point, Paul gets the popcorn and sits back and just starts watching, okay? That's kind of what's going on now. And get this, y'all, the Pharisees, if any group hated Jesus the most, who was it? It would have to be the Pharisees. Who is Paul defending? Jesus. And now look what happens. I mean, Paul is enemy number one in the whole city. He's everybody's enemy. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and they argued vigorously, "We find nothing wrong with this man." Now the people that have arrested him are his lawyers. They're defending him. This is just amazing how God works. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" And the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid for Paul. Now the people who are really in charge, really in charge, the commander, he's so worried for Paul, he's now his protector, taking care of him and sending him on his way. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him to the barracks. And that's when God told him, "Paul, don't worry about it. Take courage, Paul. Just as you have prophesied and testified about me before these men here in Jerusalem, you will also do so in Rome." Y'all, God has been working this plan out since the day of his salvation. And now the very people that have stirred up people, now the very people that want to kill him, half of the group are now defending him. The Roman commanders are protecting him. And God is moving the pieces that say, "Paul, I'm going to get you to Rome, and you're not even going to have to buy a ticket or pay for a meal. It's going to be an all-expense-paid trip to get you where I want you to go." And y'all, that is exactly what happens. When you really see the big picture here, it's amazing how God works. He can turn things completely around in ways that we could never have imagined. He can do more in a few seconds that we can do in a lifetime. He can part seas. He can speak through donkeys. He can make walls fall down with a shout. He can make water flow from a rock. I want to share with y'all this morning a very, very personal and a little bit of a painful story. Before the merger, Calvary Baptist Church is a great church. Been here 18 years. 18 years of blissful, happy ministry. Lots of people called into the ministry. Lots of them doing ministry right now. But Calvary Baptist Church had plateaued. We were getting older. We were having a more difficult time reaching young people and young couples. And I was getting frustrated, discouraged. I felt in my heart that the problem was in some ways bigger than me. And I didn't really know exactly how to fix it. But I remember meeting with some of the people, the leaders in our church, and with Perry. I remember very specifically meeting with Perry many years before the merger and said, Perry, God works in ways that we could never, ever have imagined ourselves. In ways that we couldn't have dreamed up ourselves. And we just need to kind of keep depending on Him and reaching out to Him and see what God has in plan for us and see what God has in store for us. Now, that doesn't mean don't work hard and don't keep working and don't keep trying and don't keep trying to do the Lord's work and being involved in the city and the kingdom, doing all these things. You're still trying to do them, but you're also saying, okay, God, I believe that you got answers that I don't even know about. This is not the right piece of paper. But if you want a map of all the seats in the sanctuary, here it is. Somebody's playing tricks on me. This is the right piece of paper. Y'all, anybody got an idea what this is? This is all the people that we're going to introduce as new members of Bridgeway today. Hayden Brewer and Katie Brewer, Maggie Burnett, Leah Gann, Catherine Felder, Parker Harrington, Mia Henderson, Marley Jones, Cameron Mazingo, Lola McElhaney, maybe, Mila Pogue, Sailor Reardon, Lorna Grace Russell, Hunter Stevens, Emma Kate Taylor. Welcome! If you're here, we're glad you're here. Y'all know what the average age of this group is? 20.95. Let me do something just real quick. If you are below 40 years old, would you stand up real quick? I'm so glad Joe is sitting down. Woo! Yeah. All right. Hey. Do y'all see what I'm saying? God works in ways we could never imagine. Look at what He has done. Y'all can be seated. Thank y'all for being here. I'm gonna close with 3 quick truths from our passage today. 3 quick truths from our passage today. Number 1, God can still direct our tongue. I want you to hear this. I wrote here, have you ever heard the phrase divide and conquer? I think based on Jesus' own promise to us, God gave Paul the exact and precise words to say. And God just kind of created a scenario there where it protected Paul and turned the whole situation around in ways that he probably could have never imagined. But what does that mean for you and I? Well, one thing it means is exactly what Jesus said. In those moments, if we face moments like this one, or moments where we need to be a witness or we need to defend our faith, we need to remember that we don't go into these moments alone. Jesus has has made a promise to us, and we need to lean into Him and let Him direct our speech. When you are in that place, when you are called to be a witness, remember the words that Jesus spoke. It will not be you speaking, but just lean into Jesus and let Him give you counsel. I think Joe kind of knows this. I'm sure he does the exact same thing. And if you've ever come to my office for counsel, the first thing that I do every single time is I say this: Lord, if any counsel crosses my lips, because sometimes we just need to do some listening. But Lord, if any counsel crosses my lips, may it be filtered through your truth. And then God, you direct our speech. Beyond that, I think that we need to submit our tongues to the Lord and ask His guidance in our speech in all sorts of manners. When we are upset, when we're aggravated, when we are angry, when we are asked to give counsel to someone, when we need to handle some interpersonal conflict, when we need guidance in parenting, when we need to mend some broken relationship, God can and God will direct our speech if we will just lean into Him and say, God, you be the Lord of my tongue as well. Y'all, there's probably not many things that our society needs much more than that right now. God being the Lord of our tongues. And sometimes our tongue being our keyboard and our phones and social media and all that as well. Number 2, real quickly. In those tough times, remember you are not alone. We sang just a little while ago, God, you're our fourth man in the fire. I never noticed that before, Ari, until today. I wrote in my notes, this passage had me thinking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were not alone in this moment. In these tough times, God is with you. Now, He does not have to be with you. You can ignore Him, you can forget Him, you can even shut Him out. But you also can invite Him into your pain. You can invite Him into your darkness. You can invite Him into your fear. You can invite Him into your confusion, and He can comfort you, sustain you, teach you, mold you, be present with you in these tough times. God was with Paul. God was with Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. In these really tough times, we need to remember that we don't have to be in these moments all by ourselves. We need to invite God into these moments and let Him work in ways that we could not have imagined. And number 3, even in the storm, God can and does weave His will. This leads us to the age-old question. Did God cause these events, or does He just work in spite of them and through them? I'm not going to enter into that debate about God's sovereignty and our free will. The truth is, we have a free will, and yet God still works in and through the circumstances of our lives. The occasional actions of people do not tie the hands of God and leave Him helpless. Paul wanted to go to Rome. Now Paul was going to Rome. His safety was now guaranteed. All of his travel expenses are covered. Paul's enemies and the enemies of the church are now actually plotting to help God do what He said He was going to do way back on the road to Damascus. God is using His own enemies to do His own will. So y'all, what this means to us is even in these difficult places, in these hard places, in these places that we don't understand. Ananias didn't see it. Ananias couldn't understand it. Ananias couldn't see, God, how could you ever use this guy named Paul? We're going to go through some times in our life, difficult times. We're going to be in places where we're going to look around and we're going to say, God, I do not see what you are doing. And I want you to know God can still weave His will even in the storms of life, regardless of how those storms came, regardless of their storms of our own making, regardless of their storms of somebody else's making. If we submit ourselves and our lives over to God, God can still conduct in ways that we could never believe the pieces to accomplish His kingdom will and His will in our own lives as well. God can still direct our tongues. And in those tough times, we need to remember that we are not alone. And even in those moments when we can't see what God is doing, that's when we need to put some trust in Him and just say, God, I don't see it. I don't understand it. I don't know why I'm here. Y'all, Paul probably could have said that time and time again. God, I don't know why I'm in this place after all I've done for you. But yet God was weaving His perfect will in his life. I don't know what is going on in your life. As a pastor, right now, I could name people in our congregation who are in tough places. Places that are dark, places that are hard, places that are scary, places that are confusing, places where I don't know where this leads or why I'm here. I know there are people like that. That leads me to believe there's a lot more people like that I do not know about. I want us to close the service this morning, and I've asked Ari to come and just play for a bit. And I want to give you some time this morning to just turn to the Lord with your own life in light of this scripture, proclaiming that, God, you are sovereign. And I trust you. Even in these little matters and places in my life that I don't see or I don't understand or I can't see the path out of. God, I'm going to believe that you are working your way and your will in my life. And then I'm going to come and close us in a word of prayer. Ari?